How does this area differ from what most people think of Oklahoma as being?
You know, I've talked to people from Oklahoma and told them that we're going to the mountains in Oklahoma, and they don't know what I'm talking about. Do you want me looking at you or at the film?
You can look at me.
You know, everybody thinks about the musical Oklahoma. They think about prairies and, you know, cattle and stuff like that. And it's true, around Oklahoma City, that's what it looks like. But down here in the southeast corner, there are these mountains that sort of are adjacent to the Ozarks, which everyone knows about. And they're pretty rough. They're pretty nasty. But most people, even people that live in Tulsa, which is not that far away, they don't know about these mountains. I never said that I was going to the Ouachitas and have someone go, oh yeah, the Ouachitas. They're always like, the what?
Do you have to say the Ozarks?
I never say the Ozarks because it's a distinctly different mountain range. Ozarks run east-west. The Ouachitas go north-south. Geologically, they're different, probably from a, you know, wildlife standpoint, but the Ouachitas are distinct. They're not part of the Ozarks. So I generally don't say that. I will, if they don't know what I'm talking about. Well, the Ozarks are next door, and everyone's heard of the Ozarks, right?
Yeah.
No one's ever heard of the Ouachitas. It's hard. It makes it harder to spend time being critical about other types of stuff that you experience, because you know they're no longer a question. You've seen the apes, you know they're here, so you have to be very cautious that everything you see or smell or hear doesn't turn into ape sign, because you're no longer questioning whether or not they're here. They are here. So there is actually sort of an additional layer of critical thinking that you have to apply to everything, so that you don't, you know, be one of those guys that walks into the forest and sees apes everywhere. You know, I mean, we could. That's the crazy thing about this particular place. This is a special place. We could see an ape. We could see an ape right now, but chances are we're not gonna. When I was in here last time, in last fall, Daryl was doing barred owl calls for camp, because he brings he'll bring them in and they'll sit right above him in the tree, right? And he was doing his barred owl thing, and we heard this kind of sounded like a barred owl, but it kind of sounded like a person trying to be a barred owl. And we looked at each other and we're like, what was that? And then it just made this like god-awful banshee scream, like you could just, this crazy wild woman out in the forest, which I might dismiss as like a cat, but it happened at the same, like right after we heard something making a noise like a barred owl. The whole thing was just creepy as hell. And then about half an hour later, we heard the banshee screaming again. It had moved from sort of the northwest to due west. So,
this is Echo 1. How copy?
Echo 2 copy.
Yeah, I copied that. All teams, I just heard a impact sound. My judgment, to the west. Was that either of you?
Negative. Echo 2's on the trail. We're not doing anything that would have sounded like that.
Roger that.
This is what science is like, I guess. Anyway, we heard the thing, and I mean, it was just like this banshee screaming, man, and it was at one point pretending to be a barred owl. So I don't know what to make of that.
In the 21st century, it is not difficult to find someone talking about Bigfoot.
The gospel line goes that way. There have been multiple sightings.
It requires only a few strokes of the keyboard, a visit to a nearby bookstore, or a quick search on one's streaming platform of choice. There are podcasts, documentaries, online articles, short-form videos, and endless lines of discussion available to anyone with an internet connection. But Sasquatch has been with us for quite some time. And in the early days, there were limited venues holding space for the theoretical American wood ape. After the early sensational newspaper articles of the early 20th century took hold across the world, a few would take steps to bring a sense of organization to the hunt for Bigfoot.
Came out to walk the road. There's been times when we've been out here before where we've been parallel, and actually on both sides of the road at times. And actually repeated that on the same night with another team.
Town hall meetings became one way to do this, wherein researchers presented experiencers a place to share stories and compare notes. Traditional envelope and stamp mailing lists were another. Pioneering researchers such as Don Keating of Ohio would diligently disseminate regular batches of new information to subscribers, creating an early, loose community within the Bigfoot world.
Well, what we did was, if I had somebody else with me, or even if I went by myself, I wanted to talk to them, I wanted to document their story, I wanted to do it on videotape or audio tape. I wanted to photograph the area where the thing was seen, if we could get to the area. And then I looked for evidence if it was recent enough. And there were reports that I received before the internet where a sighting had taken place within 36 hours. Because of my publicity for the meetings and things like that, people would know who to contact. You know, we would get out there, we'd try to document it, we'd try to look around, see if we could find any physical evidence. Then, without telling anyone on the outside, so to speak, either I or a group of us would go to a location where there had been reports in previous times and stake it out. You know, just sit and listen. Not during the day, but during the night. If, you know, as long as we weren't trespassing on somebody's property. You have to do it that way because you can't contact people and say, hey, I'm coming out to your property. There was an area outside New Cumberstown where reports had been coming out of in a flood in 1990 and early 91. Turned out that the majority of stuff probably wasn't real. They would call us, say, hey, we found footprints. Well, we'd get out there and some of these footprints would look pretty comical. You know, there's no way a living foot could plant that in the ground. It'd be something else. So that's what I would do. I would just try to go out to an area without announcing it and see what we could come up with.
The people in this search come at this subject from such a wide and varied background, and what they're bringing to the search, I think, to me, is very compellingly human. You know, everything from anthropologists to folklore to people who have sort of a sense of modern extreme adventuring, people who very much want to solve the mystery and would love to be able to claim that they're the ones who brought the evidence to light, people who follow in the footsteps of folks like Grover Krantz. And here, of course, I'm thinking of like a Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who very much put his academic reputation on the line in order to even have a dialogue with the Bigfoot community. And I think part of it is just seeing, you know, that blanket term of Bigfoot community, of seeing how many different smaller camps exist under that umbrella, to me is endlessly fascinating.
Make out any form other than just white, gray. And it's mostly obscured by the trees, but definitely something of size up there. I don't see anything now. And then about 10 seconds after I saw the first
Copy that. Do you think that was... Are you saying that you saw two things move or one thing move?
Same spot. I mean, I would have to think it's the same thing at this point. I don't see anything else now. All I see is green. I say again, all I see now is green. I sculpted at 6 power. All I see is green. There's nothing white or gray up there. There was an animal up there. It's good. It's got to be 70, 75 meters from me up the mountain. So just a serendipitous position to look good. And I heard some. Of course, I've got these amplified headsets on. I heard some crashing sounds over to my west. Looked over there, and then I swept back up the mountain, and that's when I saw that movement. Definitely a big flash of movement. Light colored. Looked almost white from here.
White.
No copy.
Okay, got that. Is there anything you want us to be doing? We made the big loop. We're back at camp. Is there something you want us to do?
Negative. I just wanted you to know that. I think if that's the case, I wonder if something. I wonder if when that squirrel was barking earlier, that there was one over there, and maybe it stopped me as I moved west, and it stayed up on the military crest of that mountain. I don't see it now. It's green again back there.
Oh, mercy.
So you're saying it's 75 meters away, and it's up the slope. Is it to the east of your position?
It moved over to the side, and I was looking through my 6 power of my scope. It moved over to the...
So it's this way.
It's right.
It's towards us.
It's right, man. I got chills in my whole damn body.
Shut up,
Just
Joe.
a big mass moving slowly, very slowly. From its left to its right, like it was trying to get a vantage view of me. And then it just slightly poked its head so that I could see the top of the head and slits for eyes, like right above those leaves, and then it went right back down, and then I could see little bits of white between the green leaves again, and now I can't see anything back there.
So Daryl's down there still hunting, and he saw through his scope up the slope. He saw first he saw sort of just a movement of white, some large white animal or what appeared to be white, moving through his through some foliage up there. And shortly thereafter, he saw something in that same spot. He says it appeared to be the conical head and shoulders of what we would assume to be a wood ape. He could see its eyes, he could see its nose, you couldn't really see its mouth through the foliage, but he said he saw the head and shoulders of this ape. And so what we've been doing since then is he's been listening, he's been watching for it, and he hasn't seen it until just now. But we've been hearing some wood knocks. He heard a wood knock. It sounds like there's knocks happening on both sides of him, so towards us, in between he and us, and then on the other side of him, which potentially could be an attempt to get him to move. I don't really feel like he's got that animal on the slope pinned down or anything.
But there's 3. That's what I'm saying. Knock and knock on this side is 2, trying to help
Right.
one that's
So
at the hill.
there's one on a hill, and then there's 2 others knocking, so that's at
They
least
did
3.
this to us all the time.
Um,
Like we got, remember little guy trapped?
Yeah,
They're
I
going to come down on him.
I remember it very well.
Okay.
So we're just waiting to see what happens.
The first experience that I had with what we call Bigfoot was in 1975. I just graduated high school, and I went on a elk hunting trip with my dad up in Idaho on the edge of the Salmon River Wilderness area. And we had been hunting for a couple of days, and I was up on a ridge, and my dad was supposed to be coming up an opposing ridge, and we were going to try to kick up some game to each other, and I saw something black come out into the open. It's probably 300-400 yard distance that I'm looking at, but it was unobstructed view. First I thought it was a bear, and it came across the hillside and was hiding behind some trees and some rocks, but it kept looking behind itself. So I was trying to make sure it wasn't a mother bear, a sow with cubs. And then it came across this hillside. It was really, really steep and a loose rock, like a shale that just broke loose under your feet all the way down. And I had a clear shot, and I had, a deer rifle, and I was watching it through my scope. And I thought, if I take a shot at a bear right now, it's going to go all the way down to the bottom to a real rocky creek bed, and it's going to be really difficult to extract. So it was headed for a flat spot up above it. So I decided to wait till it got to that flat spot before I took a shot so it wouldn't roll down. And it was on all fours, like I said, a solid black. I could see its hands, nothing in its hands, wasn't wearing a backpack, anything like that. It got up to this flat area, and I was just about to take the shot. It was in my crosshairs, and it stood up on two legs and kind of blew my mind. I was from West Texas. I really didn't know anything about Bigfoot, and it kind of freaked me out a little bit. Well, it confused me as to exactly what it was I was looking at, and it walked off on two legs. The hunched over cross-country skier type walking motion, and I watched it walk away. So the entire sighting, 2 or 3 minutes. And it was tough to tell the perspective of how big it actually was until a few minutes later. I didn't take the shot. Thought I was looking at a guy, a human. Kind of upset me a little bit that somebody would be out there totally dressed in black and in the back country. Very, very remote area. And until I saw something orange over at the right side. And we were all dressed in orange because that was regulations in Idaho that you wear blaze orange. And something orange caught my eye, and I'm focused in on it. First, it was so small, I thought it was a butterfly or something. And then I'm looking through my binoculars, and I realized it was my dad. It finally come out from the forest where this thing had emerged from. But my dad, in perspective, was only about half as tall, it seemed like. And I could see him looking for me, and he got on his walkie-talkie, and I stood up and waved my hat, and he said, "Son, this is just way too steep and too slick, and there's no way I can make it across this mountainside. So I'm gonna turn back." And I said, "Okay, but who's over there with you? There's some big, huge guy with you." He said, "Son, there's nobody over here but me." And I said, "Well, there is some big dude all dressed in black right above you." We didn't know what to think about that. We made our way back and we talked about what it could have been, who it could have been, couldn't figure it out. 2 days later, on the same trip, we were coming up before dawn up a snowy road, and I saw something off to the right. We all did in the truck, and it looked like a burned out stump. And the closer we got to it, just on the edge of our headlights, all snowy behind it. And it started shrinking down, got wider, and then moved slowly across this 2-track road. And it covered the entire width of the road. It went over the edge, knocked off a bunch of snow off of branches, and we stopped. We sent a guy over the edge to try and determine what it was, and he came back in a big hurry and said it was something furry trying to hide, and he was really upset. And so he urged us to get out of there right away. And we went up to the top of the mountain, hunted all day, came back down, and we stopped and tried to find some tracks or something, but by then we had 2 trucks and a lot of guys trampled. And he finally came up with the story. "Well, I know what it was that I saw." He says, "I saw a hunter on horseback wearing a fur coat with the hood pulled up." And he said it had to be on horseback, even though he didn't see the horse, because otherwise he couldn't have been as tall as he was. And that was just something that kind of stuck with me for years and years. And I didn't even realize, I didn't put 2 and 2 together. So I joined the old Bigfoot forums in 2002, and I was sharing this odd thing that had been in the recesses of my mind for like 27 years. And it was the people on the forums that said, "Dude, you saw a Bigfoot." And kind of got me interested.
Yeah, like growing up in the interior, my grandparents on my mom's side lived in Chilliwack. My grandfather was a firefighter here, so we would always we'd come down often, like about every month, just for a visit, spend Christmases, etc. Back then, before the Coquihalla opened, we had to go through the Fraser Canyon. And every time we'd kind of come down here, my dad would tell stories about just Sasquatch stories. Nothing in particular, but the Sasquatch lived here and this is where it's supposed to come from. And as a kid in the truck, I felt safe because it was dark and I'm in a truck, but I always felt a little spooked out by Sasquatch because where I live up in Kamloops is also considered Sasquatch territory as well, especially through the Shuswap Nation area. So I've kind of grown up with Sasquatch all around me, like literally in its own sense.
I got into anthropology because of Bigfoot. I'm probably one of the more unique people around in the sense that when I was a little girl, I saw Legend of Boggy Creek on television, and it affected me to a level where I thought, I want to study this mystery for the rest of my life. And I had asked my school teacher, what do I need to do to study Bigfoot? And she said, well, you're probably going to have to go into anthropology. And so it was always the course that I was headed on. You know, but I figured it out. I wasn't going to be able to study Bigfoot for a living because he hadn't been proved to be real yet. And I was like, well, I still want to do this. What else do I like about anthropology? And it was the archaeology part. It was that other mystery part of humans were here. Here's their evidence of how they were here. How can I put these puzzles together to understand how they use that landscape? And that's sort of how my approach to Bigfooting is here's the evidence of what's going on out there. How can I put all those pieces together to figure out how is Bigfoot using this landscape as well?
My name's Jonathan Wilk, and we're here in Savoy Mountain State Forest this evening. And my connection to Bigfoot was, I was a park ranger up here back in the 80s and the 90s, and I had one run right out in front of my pickup truck one night, about a mile from where we are tonight.
Yes, I went to the town hall meeting in Chehalis First Nation, the longhouse there, and that's where I met Thomas Steenberg. And from there, I got to meet Bill Miller. And then at that time, I decided to join the BCSCC, which is the BC Cryptozoological Society. And from there, it just took off, because when I found out that John Kirk was an ex-RCMP officer, and I, being a police officer myself, we gelled and we spoke the same language, so to speak. And we started getting into the investigative aspect of the Bigfoot, and it's just so intriguing and so exciting. It's a never-ending story, actually, and it just keeps going and going and going. You know, are you ever going to find enough evidence to prove there's a Sasquatch? I don't know, but it's the fun of it. It's the excitement, and for me, for my family, when I told them, and I have 4 children, that I'm doing this, they just about had a fit. They couldn't understand it, but after a while, they wanted to come out with me and see what I did, and they found it intriguing and fascinating.
Originally from Northeast Texas, served in the United States Air Force Intelligence, 6 years active duty. Well, I'm originally from an area in Northeast Texas, Cass County, Texas, which is directly adjacent to Miller County, Arkansas, which has a long, long history of reported encounters with an upright, hairy, bipedal animal. And so I heard stories when I was 4 and 5, 6 years old. I always had an interest in it from that point. My dad used to tell stories, and you know, relatives would tell stories, and friends of the family, and so I mean, I actually remember when the film The Legend of Boggy Creek came out. We knew about it well before that film ever came out. As I got a little older, I went into the Air Force Intelligence. I became pretty skeptical about it. I thought there's no way that, you know, something can exist like that. You know, it's got to be a myth. I started to apply critical analysis and that sort of thing, and I made a vow to some of my fellow airmen, and I said one day I'm going to look into it. I'm actually going to go spend time where these things are seen, and I'm going to, you know, look into it and first establish for myself whether or not it actually exists, and then prove it to everybody else. And then time went by, I forgot about that, and was on a trip west through New Mexico, and we were driving through the mountains of the forest, and my daughter asked me if I thought Bigfoot could live in that area. And I thought, well, you know, I don't know. That's a good question. And it kind of piqued my interest again. When I got home, I started looking into that, and that's when I found Alton Higgins and met him, and we linked up, and then we formed a partnership that we've had now ever since, you know, the early 2000s, a very close friendship, and we've been pursuing this thing.
Well, I'm Matt Pruitt. I've been involved in the pursuit of the Sasquatch for a long time, a little over 20 years now. And so I've worn a lot of hats during that time. I was a member of the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization and the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, worked on finding Bigfoot. I produce a podcast called Bigfoot and Beyond with Cliff and Bobo. And last year I released a book called The Phenomenal Sasquatch. So done a lot of travel, a lot of investigations, and again, worn a lot of hats during that time. Fortunately, yes. And so when I first started networking with other local Sasquatch researchers in the Southeast, you know, I'd been doing research on my own for a number of years and was utterly alone in that pursuit. And then was fortunate to meet some people in about 2006 who were doing research, and they turned me on to an area in the upper Nantahala River Valley, which is pretty close to where we're sitting now. And the first outing that I went out there was during the wintertime of 2006, and we heard characteristic vocalizations there from above camp, from basically a knob, like a small hill, not necessarily a mountain, but you know, a sizable hill above camp. And they were the classic, you know, what people colloquially refer to as the Ohio howl, you know, a big bellowing, moaning howl, a series that where it basically ascends to a certain pitch and sustains that and then descends in pitch, kind of like the howls that I try to emulate when we're out in the field. And that was remarkable to hear. And I've been to that location subsequently and heard those same category of sounds again. Taken other people to that place and they've heard the sounds as well. And then have had what seemed to be a potentially close encounter one night in the dark, you know, a very large animal moving around that didn't behave in a way that would be readily attributable to like bear behavior or something like that. But again, I didn't see anything in that situation, but an anomalous experience nonetheless. And then beyond personal experiences, I've interviewed multiple witnesses from around here.
There is much to be said about the history and legacy for the hunt of Bigfoot. Many, many stories to be told, pieces of evidence to be examined and debated, and many thousands of miles to cross. Here, we've examined only a small sampling of the greater Sasquatch story, and there are others who have made essential contributions along the way. Countless shaded corners may conceal the American wood ape from the untrained eye, and at any time we may stumble across proof. While the journey continues, the legacy of the early pioneers is preserved by the new generation, even as the approach changes. Long stretches in the woods, outfitted for days of rugged conditions, typify the search for many of those involved, always with the persistent possibility that this expedition, this trip, this search just might be the one to do it. The one to prove to the world that something strange is living in the woods. The legacy of the search for Sasquatch is still being written. For many, the search for Bigfoot typifies an aspect of life which is essential, the belief in the possibility of the impossible, humankind's connection with nature, and the relentless, ongoing, now century-running pursuit of the truth. The journey shows no signs of ending. What we may find along the way remains to be seen. Some wish to preserve the creature of future human encroachment. Others wish to validate the documented eyewitness testimonies, sometimes their own, which continue to accrue. And still others simply dare to ask, what if?
Right. Well, at the time I was in college, and I was also working for summers for the, back then it was the Department of Environmental Management, the DEM, who ran all the state forests and parks. So I was a seasonal park ranger up here in Savoy Mountain State Forest, and I was assigned to the 4 to 12 shift for the summer, which meant I monitored the campground and checked the outlying boundaries and patrolled the forest. So it was a really hot summer night, and we just had a thunderstorm. And I always remember that fresh smell of the ozone in the air. Had the window rolled down. It was probably about 80 degrees out. Listening to the Red Sox on my AM radio, checking some of the outlying boundaries, which one of them is not too far from here. So I pulled into this place called Tannery Falls parking lot. It's a day use area where people can have a picnic and also go visit this 300-foot cascading waterfall that was formed during the last ice age when the glaciers retreated. And I get out of the truck to pick up some garbage that was on the ground, and as I came around the truck, this noise came from the woods. This 6.5 foot tall hairy creature came running out, grabbed the trash in front of me and took off around the other side of the truck. As it came around the side of the truck, looked me right in the eye. I was pretty much paralyzed with fear and shock and awe. I went to jump in the truck, and when I turned, there was about an 8.5-foot one standing behind the truck that let out a scream that can only be compared to probably a gorilla and a lion screaming at the same time. The other one took off. It was out of sight because it was pitch dark up there. All you could see was just what the headlights and taillights were illuminating. Well, I was just shocked. I wasn't up there expecting to run into a creature that I never heard of existed in New England, never mind the East Coast. It was always, to me, I thought about when I thought of this creature, something that was out on the West Coast.
Like a lot of people, it started as a kid with experiences that I can't explain. But where I grew up, an hour to the east was Shuswap Lake, and we had a cabin on it. And that's where you'd hear stories of Sasquatch. You'd see like the broken trees where they're snapped at a certain angle. And when I was a teenager, I had an experience that I didn't equate to Sasquatch so much at the time until I was an adult. But a friend of mine and I, we were free-range children. My parents would let us roam in the woods as long as we're back for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And we'd come down for dinner, and we always take the same path down, and you pass this stand of trees, and they're pine trees, and the ground is constantly littered with pine needles. After dinner, we wanted to go back out for one last rip in the woods and do some exploring. We're going back up along that same trail, and underneath those trees, all the pine needles have been removed. A lean-to's been built, but a small one. Inside that lean-to is a bone that's been picked clean. And that was just odd, especially in the span of an hour that happened. And the sun's setting, and we're getting kind of creeped out, and we figured, let's just go back to the cabin. We did that, but couldn't stop talking about it all night. So first light, we got up, we got dressed, we went back to that spot. All that's gone, and the pine needles are back. And it's an experience that stuck with me. And as an adult, I was talking to a friend of mine who's like an indigenous storyteller and artist, and he's had his own Sasquatch experiences. He says, you saw the little people. And if you believe Sasquatch from an indigenous perspective, it's a dimension walker, and it's not the only one. And the little people are kind of tricksters associated with Sasquatch that come out and play tricks on people, and they're mischievous, and they also cause you a lot of grief. So he said that's what we saw. Was the signs that they were around and couldn't get back through the dimension by dark, so they camped out and stayed and then left in the morning. And that's kind of really kicked off a re-interest in me in sort of Sasquatch lore.
So it's Monday, and that day started out pretty typical, but there's 4 cabins in this location. And so for my very first ever rock throws, we hear a rock come and hit, it was very distinct, on what we would call the east cabin. And so all the guys go over there, and they're looking at what is, and they kind of sort of see something on the hillside, but nothing really exciting. But I'm just standing there, and I said, just leave me here, I'm not interested in running around and getting all sweaty, for something that might not be anything. And I'm looking off what we call the bottleneck, and I see this bush, the limbs have been like this, and I see them just easily be lit up, and there's something dark behind it. And I'm like going, well, that's really weird. And so when they're coming back, I said to Brian and to everybody, there's something in that bush. Would you guys please look it out, look into it? And the next thing you know, there's a rock throw over then on the south cabin. And so Brian kind of looks into it, and he goes, oh, there's a path out of there. They're not there anymore. And so they take off, but I asked my husband to stay, and I said, would you really look in there? Really, really look in there. And so he sticks his head in there, and he's looking, really looking, and he goes, well, honey, there's nothing in here but like 2 or 3 logs, and there just really isn't anything. And I just went, oh, well, all right, they got away from me. So they all come back, and we're sitting around a fire ring. No fire around it because it's, like maybe 6:30, 7 o'clock in the evening. It's May. There's still plenty of light. And I'm the one mostly looking down the bottleneck, but it's Bob and Brian. And then Mark McClurkin has kind of a side view, but poor Ken Stewart, his view is going to be the outhouse. It's the best view anybody could ever have, of course. And we hear this scuffling noise, kind of thing. And we're just like, what in the world? Who's this? Something's making a racket. And so I can see down the bottleneck, and there they are. There's 2 animals, a big one and a little one, kind of doing this scurry kind of thing where this one's running ahead and then this one tries to catch up, and it looks like they're trying to get behind a shed or at least get close to us. And it's very clear, even though they're doing this, they don't know we're here. They can't see us. And so I jump up and I go, there they are. And I ran toward them. And then they bolt up this hillside, you know, it was like this, like it was nothing. I mean, it was, he said, Brian says a spring, I say a bungee. It looked like somebody had let loose a bungee and they just went whew, to the top of that. Like, at first I was like, those are ghosts. And then I turned to Bob and I was like, we can't win this. We're just not physically capable of doing this. And then I said, I told you they were still there. That's the only logical sense that it made, was that they had been in that bush that entire time. We didn't recognize it for what it was, and then they thought we were gone. They got up out of the bush and then we're coming to see, well, where did they go? Where are they at now?
In 2010, of course, Vancouver hosted the Winter Olympics, and we had a gentleman from NBC News Atlanta who, as a child, grew up in BC, then his parents moved stateside. And he wanted to do a piece on Sasquatch. So we just wandered down a trail, and then he was asking us to relay stories, you know, history of the area and Sasquatch sightings. And then he asked us about the wood knock thing. So we told him a little bit about that. You know, it's an assumption that a lot of people make, that they utilize banging rocks together, or, you know, rock on wood to communicate with each other. So in any case, he decided that, well, let's do a demonstration. So I wandered around, found a suitable piece of wood. He set his camera up, and it's on what they call Deer Lake Trail. And so behind him was a very steep bluff. So he's got his camera set up. He's filming. I do a knock, and we stand there patiently waiting for a reply. Well, I'll be damned if we got one. But the best part of the whole thing was this gentleman from Atlanta. He's bending over looking at the camera, and he stands up and he goes, "Y'all heard that, right?" Yeah, that was funny. That was astounding. I mean, you know, we all just rolled our eyes. Like, you know, it always happens. You know, you bring somebody up for the first time and they find a print, or this happens or that happens. And we go for hundreds of hours and get nothing. But we bring somebody along and they go, "Oh, look what I just saw back here," right? Yeah, that was interesting.
My favorite place is that upper Nantahala River Valley, just because I've had personal experiences there. Almost every time I've been there, I've heard those characteristic vocalizations. And one of the most interesting things that happened, we were there one time years ago. It was in the fall of 2012, and there was a gentleman with us who was fairly skeptical but interested. You know, wasn't readily accepting, you know, the proposition, but was willing to get out in the field and look and see. And one night, he had heard, we were all kind of fast asleep, but he was in a tent, I was sleeping in a vehicle, so it was a little more sound buffered that particular night. But in the morning he said, "Oh yeah, did you hear that air raid siren that went off on that hill last night?" And I was like, "There's no air raid siren up here." And he's like, "Oh, it must have been a weather siren." And I was like, "No, there are no weather sirens around here, I promise you." And I even went as far in the aftermath as to call the county and then the ranger district that covers that part of the Nantahala National Forest and the largest local campground nearby to say, "Do you have anything like a weather siren that you blast to warn if there's an impending, you know, thunderstorm or something of that nature?" And they all emphatically said no. And then I played this gentleman the recording of the Ohio howl, and he's like, "Oh yeah, that's what I heard. That's a siren." I said, "That's not a siren," you know. And so to have my own experiences there, which obviously, you know, no one is immune to confirmation bias, let alone me. You know, no human being that's ever lived is. But to have someone else of a sort of a different perspective and sort of a different filter for the natural world be exposed to the same sounds and hear it, even though he attributed it to something else that just wasn't there, a weather siren, was really interesting.
Sure, I was leading a BFRO expedition up here of about 20 people. It was in 2016, and I took them to the same area where I had my encounter, and we encountered this awful thunderstorm, and I'm thinking, what am I going to do with everybody all day long in this pouring rain? Well, we were already soaked to the bone, and I said, well, I'm going to take you up the street a little ways to this other area that I like. We had a couple young kids with us. We let them do a couple of hollers, and we immediately got a holler back, and everybody looked at each other. We we realized everyone was accounted for. We weren't really surprised. I was surprised because I was just taking people up there to kill time. And then Jeff Shepard, who was here with us tonight, he came running up the trail and said, "Hey, I got whistles and wood knocks over here. Is that you guys?" And we said, "No, we don't have anything." So we set up a little bit of a skirmish line and we started pushing through the woods. Well, lo and behold, we see this black thing weaving back and forth behind the moose maple trees.
So we turned around and kind of just spread out for a little bit, went in about 30 yards maybe. And we were standing there, I was standing on this little rock, and I was looking to my right. And I was bent down, and I could see something black, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I says, okay, so I stood up, and I'm looking at it, and I leaned to the left. It leaned to the left. I leaned back to the right. It leaned to the right, and I says, oh boy. I says, it's right there. So I took off after it. And when I took off after it, John actually saw the bottom half of it, and he was coming in.
And as we approached it, it took off running through the woods. All I was able to see was the swinging arm and the shoulder. Eric got to see the head and the feet moving. And he said that it was interesting because the lower part of the body was not in sync with the upper part of the body. So it's like a cartoon where you see the legs moving, but the body's just kind of floating. And that's congruent to a lot of other reports that we talked about. So we tried to pursue it and it was gone, but we managed to cast 3 pretty good tracks up there.
It's eerie. If there was something approaching, you would hear it coming from quite a distance. So this is squatching in a way. Like sometimes we'll go somewhere and set up a little camp and start a little fire and just sit around and play a little music. We seem to get some good responses with like classical music, like Mozart or Beethoven or Bach or something like that, like a classical music. They're not into like rock and roll. It just takes a lot. But if they're around and you shut that music off, all of a sudden you get like knock, 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 knock. Like, hey, we really like that. And when you hear your first wood knock, you'll be like, oh, that's what a wood knock sounds like. Because there's nothing else. No, absolutely. It's like, and you know something with a hand did that. Whether it's a popping noise they do with their hands or that it's a rock clack or something, you'll know it. And one of the most terrifying things you'll hear is a tree break, where they'll take a large tree and they'll break it off, and it's just this crack, 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 pow! And it's an intimidation thing, because I tell you, it's very unnerving when you hear it. And that's when it's time to leave, because it can just get more aggressive from there. We've had stuff thrown at us that's pretty exciting. Pine cones and stuff. And, yeah, so it's pretty cool.
Here in the Adirondack State Park, I have been part of a rock throwing incident. Drove up late one night, got out, messing with gear. It's sprinkling out, just a miserable night. But as soon as we got out of the car, we had some knocks right away. The other individuals said they could hear something. I did not, probably because I was too busy fumbling around with my gear in the car. Then I got out, and as another investigator was pulling his camera, big 4K camera, brand new camera out to film what we were doing, do some low light stuff to practice, to see how stuff was working. And it was kind of a gear testing mission. It wasn't we're gonna go up and investigate, but we know a spot we can go to. We know it was a good control environment. But the other investigator had his sighting in that location. He had a face-to-face encounter. So as I'm leaning over the top of the car, or like I said, a rock comes over, it hits me in the forehead, and I look up, and I'm like, okay, are there acorns? Is it a tree? It's nothing. And then another one comes over the top, and it skids across. I had the audio going in typical fashion. You got the GoPro going, but it's only got a 10-minute battery, and it just died on me at that point. I tried to get the thermal camera up. We scanned the area. We had scanned everything ahead of time, but I'd put everything down while I was waiting for the, you know, not to waste any batteries, or waiting for the other investigator to get his camera up. He ended up taking a good face full of rocks because he was in the back of the car. So I had the barrier between me.
The search continues in the new millennium with new technologies, innovative techniques, and additional approaches being introduced as the strange things in the woods continue to lurk in the darkness. Evidence turns up at various times with unpredictable and often sparse frequency, adding to a growing pile of footprints, audio recordings, eyewitness reports, and even the occasional hair sample. The continued lack of a formal scientific classification has led some, many of them researchers and investigators who continue to put boots on the ground, to believe that a live specimen is the only path to discovering the truth, to completing the long sought-after prize chased by so many investigators, the reality behind the Sasquatch phenomenon.
You know, we've had some, you know, again, this is maybe some vocals out of this area. The other campsite up the road, we've had a lot more visual stuff. Although the campsite parking area, which is a distance, in 2003 there was actually an eyewitness. I'll kill that for you.
Nice.
There was an actual eyewitness account where a guy was sleeping in the car.
No kidding.
And he opened up the door to urinate, and it hit something. He looked down, he saw something here, he looked up, and one was looking down at him.
Wow.
When he looked back up at it, he just turned around and walked away. So,
the legacy of Bigfoot is not only one of frightening witnesses and disturbing small communities. It has a side effect. Towns and cities adopt the hairy humanoid as mascots and merchandising gold mines. With a symbol as recognizable as the Sasquatch, opportunities to sell t-shirts, as well as any other form of tourist-friendly merchandise one can think of, are found in abundance in dozens of North American communities. Locations such as Fouke, Arkansas, Jefferson, Texas, and Estes Park, Colorado, as well as many, many others, have such a rich history of Bigfoot stories that they have become essential destinations for those seeking out the hairy monster. The merchandising of monsters has become a multi-million-dollar industry, and it is not only small towns and monster museums which have gotten in on the trend. Bigfoot runs rampant throughout pop culture, finding itself a storytelling vehicle in every genre imaginable, and the butt of innumerable jokes. Much like the alien greys and flying saucers which are synonymous with Roswell, New Mexico, and Rachel, Nevada, Bigfoot is as much a part of popular culture as the idea of the movie star itself. Events and annual conferences spring up all over the country, in places such as Ohio, Tennessee, Florida, and Texas, and more are announced seemingly every year. They welcome local and out-of-state visitors by the thousands, providing an opportunity for both the believer and hardcore researcher to swap notes and trade stories, and further demonstrate the breadth of Sasquatch fever in 2025. Well-known figures in the cryptozoological world, the modern representatives of the likes of the Four Horsemen and Tom Slick, engage in face-to-face interactions with the community when they aren't knee-deep in the underbrush of some isolated forest. To say that the face of Sasquatch phenomenon has evolved and that its impact has grown would seem a drastic understatement. Whole lives are structured around thousands of miles crossed and innumerable dollars spent in some cases, maximizing the opportunity to do one thing: search for Bigfoot.
When you go out into the woods and you look for a creature that supposedly doesn't exist to begin with, and you take a dozen or two or three people, two or three dozen people out there, and you make all the noise in the world to try and attract something to come to you, any animal in the woods is going to not come to you, but run away from you because you're acting crazy. You're just acting like you're making all kinds of noise in the forest. That's not. I don't think that's going to attract anything in. I mean, I'm admittedly have made noises myself, like we've hit wood on wood before to see if something would respond to us. We've made yells before, but we didn't do it nonstop. We didn't do it all night. I don't know what's going on today. I've been out of it for a while, but in 2005, 6, 7, there were some people out there doing some good work. There were some people out there that were investigating it with a different look on it, a different twist. You know, whether or not it's a paranormal creature or not, whether or not it's a UFO, a dimensional creature, whatever the case may be. And again, like I said earlier, that's their opinion. If they can prove it, have at it.
Patience. You start with your patience. And you go in there with a mindset of, okay, you look at your environment, you look at what's around you to start with, the time, date, place, location. I am not a researcher, I'm an investigator. I would leave that up to those people in that field, those experts, to take the evidence and run with it from there. As far as tree knocks and howls and stick structures and things of that nature, unless you know what's making that, don't make an assumption that it's going to be a Sasquatch. However, considering some of the circumstances and that have happened in the past with many cases, you could deduce that, well, it's plausible, it's feasible that this could have come from an unknown large bipedal animal.
Well, anything that I would have to add to this is purely speculative, because there's really, without going into a long drawn out scientific protocol that we try to follow as much as we can, unless you can duplicate something, over and over again, like Jane Goodall did with Living with the Chimps, we're not going to know much about these creatures. One thing I do know for sure, they want nothing to do with us. And I think that they've managed to survive this long because of their abilities to adapt to their environment. Most of us can adapt to our environment when we really need to. And I think they've just been living among us, trying to avoid us as much as possible, and adapting to their environment.
I think everybody needs to get along. I think everybody needs to work together, no matter what their opinions are. I mean, if you have if you have a group that believes they're UFO connected, okay. If you have a group that thinks they're physical flesh and blood, okay. Work together, compare notes. Because if you work against each other, you're less likely to get a result at the end than what you are if you're working together and putting your resources together. I think that's what needs to be done. I tried to do that myself for years, and you just can't do it. I don't know why. Human nature, different agendas, I don't know. But I couldn't do it. I held the first conference in '89 because I wanted to get different regional researchers together to compare notes as to average foot size length that's been discovered, print sizes, what's the typical color, the average height, day or night, what were people doing. And I had 4 or 5 people invited to speak at that conference, and all of them but one canceled at the last minute because of one thing or the other, and the other, personal reasons. But I think you have to get together and you have to compare notes and you have to try and come to some kind of medium common ground to try and find this thing.
Talk about the string trap.
Okay, so right now we're under a string trap. This one is number 6. We've got a lot of string traps this year. We've got more than a dozen right now. The purpose of the string trap is we want to be able to sort of pick up movement patterns of the apes as they move around in the area near where we are. So we put these strings up, and here, this one's probably, I'm 6 foot, so that's probably at least 7 feet up, right? Maybe 6'10", something like that. And they're tied on one end, and they're wrapped around on the other side. So what happens is, when something comes through here, something that tall, it picks up the string and drags the string in the direction of its travel. So you can figure out, was it moving to the south? Was it moving to the north? And then over time, you start to develop sort of a roadmap of what's this, because there's game trails everywhere, but which ones do the apes use? Which ones do they like? And so this is what we do. And then what we do is we build on this. When we deploy the radio tags, we'll find string traps that have gone off or been tripped, and we'll hang a radio tag on this. We don't have any deployed right now because it's still early in the season, but the radio tag would look like a piece of leaf litter hanging in a spider web. And that's how we tagged the ape just up the valley. Was exactly like this. Was a string trap that looked just like this. So these are really critical pieces of our research that we do here, trying to determine the movement patterns of the apes around us. We had a member who was able to take the tag technology and integrate it with a system with the string traps so that if an animal, an ape, walked through these string traps, the tag would affix itself to the animal. Essentially, the animal would self-tag itself. And that is something that in all the literature we've looked at, and we've tried to figure this out. We can find no examples of any biologist using a system where the animal put the radio telemetry device on its body through what it was doing in the environment, and then that biologist was able to track the animal. But that's what we did. The string trap was actually very near the cabin we were staying in. It walked through the trap, the tag affixed itself. We were able to, the team that was in place was probably not using the technology correctly, so they were sensing the tag signal everywhere because the gain was very high on the receiver. But over the course of several months, we were able to track that animal for miles around. It had a range. We were picking up signals much further away than we were expecting, and it really helped us establish a working idea of how large the range is for at least that animal that tagged itself. And you start going through the kinds of animals that could have done that. It's a pretty short list. Maybe an owl or some kind of flying animal went through there and could have just randomly hit the string. However, in the course of trying to figure out how to deploy the tag onto the animal, we did tests with the system that we were using, which was basically a hollowed out cockle some glue from a rat trap. Those were really ineffective attaching to feathers, or very short fur like you would find on like a mountain lion, for example. So or it could have been a bat. I mean, again, there aren't that many animals that can be at that level and trigger that string trap. When you factor in the range that we were able to track this tag all around, for miles around this area, then the number of animals becomes even smaller. A bat's not going to have that kind of a range. It's not going to be able to carry that tag around. It's not going to stick to an owl. So you start to find sort of a smaller and smaller possible set of characters that could be carrying the tag. We were able to track this tag over the course of several months over an area of 70 square miles. And that is over, those are 70 square miles, but those aren't 70 flat miles. Again, there's very steep, this terrain is very steep. It was going up and over ridges into other valleys. It went far and wide. I think that our perception was that these animals would be in this particular place, this valley, and not leave, but this animal, for whatever reason, didn't do that. It was up and out, around, all around this area. We never found the tag. The tag stopped transmitting at the end of its natural life. I had hoped actually that we would find the tag, that it would be laying on the ground, beeping away, covered in fur. That would have been fantastic. We could then at least have identified who was carrying it around and potentially had a DNA sample, but it never happened. I think that whatever animal picked up that tag is now a permanent part of its body. It's never gonna lose that tag.
The search for Sasquatch has ranged far and wide across the United States of America, and in truth, across many parts of the world. To name every state and every territory in which the ape-like legendary creature is said to have a presence would require a listing of nearly all 50 states and locations on almost every continent, especially if one considers the many, many legends which are considered Sasquatch-like, called by different names, but all describing generally the same thing. A half-human, half-ape seeming creature which remains both elusive and frightening, leaving stories and shaken witnesses in its wake. But despite how widespread the phenomenon is said to be, there are several noteworthy hotspots. Places thought of as being inseparable from Bigfoot lore, often famous are either big-name cases or continued sequences of activity. But of a few of the places generally cited are New York, Oklahoma, Oregon, Florida, Pennsylvania, Arkansas, and of course the great land Alaska. Even Canada and Mexico often play host to Sasquatch reports and inexplicable sightings, defying the idea that the Bigfoot phenomenon is purely an American event. Recently, enthusiasts as far away as the United Kingdom have made contributions to the discussion, daring to ask if the creature might be found in other parts of the globe, and one can't forget the monster legends of Australia, Asia, and other far-off regions. Sasquatch hunters, as they are sometimes called, take to the field in ones, twos, and other small denominations, totaling up to a veritable army of dedicated searchers. While no official registry exists, it is not unreasonable to estimate that the number of parties invested in the Sasquatch search today numbers at least in the thousands, perhaps even the millions.
So I set up the blind there. I don't know, how long was I there? Hour and a half, 2 hours?
Something about that.
And then I started hearing a squirrel barking up the mountain behind. So I was facing west, and he was like, well, I was facing like west, north, or northwest with my back, and he was barking directly behind me up the mountain. And so then I had to totally turn around, and I took my headphones off to hear what it was like with the just natural hearing. There's a big rock over there. First of all, I went and sat by that big rock for a little bit, looking south. That's what it was. Because I didn't have a good position in my blind to face the southwest, and that squirrel was barking behind me. So I went to that rock, big rock, about 40 meters west of my position, just so I could face southwest. And I sat there for 15 or 20 minutes, looking up the mountain. And then I kept looking over here, and I saw, well, that looks like a pretty good little trail over there. So I went and checked it out, and it's like a little, almost like a draw, but it's just sort of sand. And I don't know how much longer it was after that, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes or so. That's when I saw it looked like, I swear it just looked like a shoulder with a head. And it was like, and it was really obscured. I mean, there was a lot of leaves and vegetation between me and it, and it was using it. And I could just see, because I'm looking through 6 power now, my scope. I mean, I'm sitting there looking, and it's like it moved. I mean, and that's when chills went up my body, because I could see this white mass just moving, and it must have moved 3 or 4 feet, just kind of just like this. And I still can't see a head. What I'm seeing, what I perceive that I'm seeing now is like a shoulder. It's like a line of something, and it's just going like this. And then it just kind of pushes back, and I see the vegetation move, and then I could see, like, it looks like a head with 2 eyes, and it's like, just like that, and then I can't see it anymore, and then it's completely still. What I perceive happen is this guy is up there. Either he's been tracking me as I'm moving west, and now he's trying to get a visual on me, or, I mean, if he could see me, he's got bionic eyes from up there. Because when I went up there, just looking through my natural vision, I don't think there's any way that you should have been able to see me totally camoed out the way that I am.
Yeah, I mean, I get frustrated with this quite a bit. I get frustrated, I get discouraged quite often, because it's extremely difficult. It's not easy at all. And when you see one, and it's a fleeting glimpse, and it's like it's right beyond your fingertips, it just, it's very frustrating, and you get tired of coming in and just coming into this place and having to prep for it, and because it's a very preparation oriented sort of site and trip. I mean, you can't. It's very remote, and so you have to bring in all your food, you have to bring in all your water, you have to make sure all the logistics are in place, and you have to arrange all the teams coming in, because we do these operations for 130 days, and so you have to set all that up. You have to make sure all these teams are filled, and you have to keep the morale of the team up. And I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that there are times where I do, absolutely, I get frustrated. And plus, I miss home when I'm here. I love being out here, but at the same time, I love my wife, and I like to be with my wife too. But I have a mission here, and it's like it's just something I have to do. I feel like we have an ethical responsibility to ensure that the world knows that this species exists. I think potentially there's a great mine of information that could help humankind, whether it's medical, maybe even questions about our own lineage, that sort of thing. I mean, I think there's just a great
potential amount of information that could come from the discovery of this animal. And so I think we have this great responsibility, particularly those of us who know firsthand that they exist. I think we have an ethical responsibility to make sure that this is done.
Well, you know, I'll tell you, you know, I come at it from a little bit different perspective, okay? I feel like I have people at a disadvantage when I try to talk to them about these. I get a lot of resistance. It's not something that I offer up that, you know, hey, you should be thinking about wood apes being real, Bigfoot is real. You know, I really don't care whether they believe it or not. But what I do care about is protecting the environment and protecting the animals' habitat so that they can thrive. And it's not just them, it's like the entire ecosystem.
I think the biggest change in how I approach this subject as sort of an abstract versus how I used to be very engaged. I wanted to talk to a lot of people about their experiences. I wanted to sort of evangelize the fact that there were good reasons to believe that wood apes were real animals. And maybe in a way that is counterintuitive, the more sure I became, and when I started having my own experiences where it was a dead certainty that these animals were real and around me, my interest in trying to prove it went down commensurate measure. I never could understand before I was coming in here and before I had my own experiences. You would talk to a witness and they would say, I don't care if you believe me or not, that's what happened. I never could understand that. I'm like, if that's what happened to you, then you should be trying to convince me. You should be trying to convince everybody. And then I had my own experiences and I heard myself say the same thing. I'm like, well, I'm just gonna tell you what happened. You can believe it or not. I really don't care. And that, I never expected to hear myself say that. I used to be a vocal advocate of the logic and the reasoning behind why people would take this seriously. And the more sure I became, the less interested I became in trying to convince anyone. Now I just tell people what I'm doing. I don't wait for them to ask me a question. I don't volunteer any more information. And if they think I'm crazy, they can think I'm crazy because I know what I've seen, I know what I've experienced, and nothing can change that.
You got to be objective. You can't throw your own opinions in there. It's just what you see as far as the evidence is concerned. Don't start guessing. Don't start assuming because there's a tree knock, it's going to be a Sasquatch. I've heard of people, you know, going out there and, of course, hoaxing. And they're getting their kicks out of people hoaxing. And they want to see your reaction. I don't go for the hoaxing, and I only go for the evidence and the facts. This is, again, a never-ending story that's going to keep going on and on and on.
We love this animal. We know it exists, and he has the right to exist, but he's not going to be able to exist if there's no trees or resources for him to exist within and from. If Bigfoot is found, a specimen found in Washington, everybody go, okay. But that doesn't mean they're in Oklahoma, doesn't mean they're anywhere else. Finding a Bigfoot in Oklahoma, proving he's real here, has ramifications for the entire rest of the United States of America. If he's here, he's in British Columbia, he's in Washington, he's in Oregon, he's in California, he's in all these other places that have had traditional sightings and known populations. And so that's why it's so important that we do it here.
Bigfoot's had his resurgence sort of lately in the last, say, 10 years. He's become more popular. There's more shows about it, more people doing things on YouTube. Whereas I think kind of when I was growing up, it was big, and then it just somehow through like the 80s and into the 90s, he fell by the wayside. And I think people are kind of wanting more out of life than just the 9-to-5 workday, grow old, die, you're done, right? The people want something. We like that mystery. We like that. We like to ask questions. Is there more going on around us than we think there is? Is there more to life than just this? Is there like a whole other world out there that we don't know about? So I think we're on the cusp of sort of maybe an even broader resurgence, not just in Sasquatch, but in all this phenomena.
You know, everybody loves a mystery. Everybody loves a quest. You know, everybody loves an adventure, and that's what this is. This is an adventure with my friends, and I could think of a lot worse things to be doing than being out in the woods looking for the most mysterious creature on the planet. We have, no matter where we go, whether we're on a different part of the country or we're right here in our backyard, we always have a good time. most of the time we leave with an unremarkable result, but we still spent the night out with our friends and having a great time.
Perhaps more than any other creature in the realm of unsolved encounters, Sasquatch has a tangible impact on the people who find themselves captivated by it, even those who have never witnessed it for themselves. Many balance the necessities of full-time employment and familial relationships with their ongoing and seemingly never-ending search for the Bigfoot entity, regardless of who or how many may insist that they are wasting their time. There is something in the potential for a large, undiscovered species with human-like attributes and superior animal intelligence that captivates the imagination. It is not enough for many to simply say maybe. They are instead driven to find out, to siphon rumor and conjecture through the filter of truth and take a hard look at what remains. For some, it would almost seem to be a compulsion, something which can't be ignored or overlooked, and disregarding the skepticism which pervades much of the scientific and academic communities. While those who chase Bigfoot do so with varying degrees of conviction, experience, and bearing a multitude of motivations and hoped-for outcomes, Sasquatch is, observably, a unifying factor in these infinitely diverse lives and human experiences. It is, in some ways, a leveler, a place for every person willing to ask, what if, to establish common ground. Opinions as to the nature of Sasquatch, what it is, where it comes from, and where it goes when we can't seem to find it, are as diverse as those seeking the questions themselves. But we, form a community bound by a common and irrefutable presence in the year 2025, the history and legacy of Sasquatch.